Hi everyone, my name is Dean Yates. I am a journalist and writer, and it's great to be here today. I'm going to talk about moral injury and journalists and my own experience of moral injury, which goes back to my years reporting overseas with the international news agency Reuters, and how I came to, I guess, understand that what I was going through was both PTSD and moral injury. For me, I had been working as a journalist for quite some time overseas. I'd spent a lot of time in working in Southeast Asia. I had covered a lot of traumatic events. I'd covered the Bali bombings, the Boxing Day tsunami in Indonesia's Aceh province. I'd had a number of assignments to Iraq, a lot of natural disasters. I had a year in Jerusalem, but it was during my time in Baghdad in 2007 when I was the bureau chief for Reuters, height of the Iraq War, that I guess was really the critical time for me in terms of the impact on my mental health. And this was a time when I'm sure a lot of you will recall the US had invaded Iraq in 2003. By the time 2007 came around, early 2007, Iraq was essentially in civil war. The violence was off the charts. Car bombs would rattle the windows of our office almost every single day. It was hell on earth, and it was a country that a lot of foreign media we were really concerned about the risks that our staff, mainly our Iraqi staff, were taking every day because of the danger and the threat to their lives. The death toll among journalists was already horrendous by the time I arrived in Baghdad in early 2007. I think nearly 160 journalists and media workers had already been killed by then. But this was the world's biggest story. We had to cover it. There were 130,000 troops in Iraq. The war was going very badly for America, and Bush was going to throw the dice one more time. He had announced the surge of US troops into Iraq. He was going to send more troops, even though US opinion had really soured on the war, and public opinion had gone very, very negative. So the Reuters operation in Baghdad at the time, we were the biggest foreign news organization there. We had 100 people, journalists, support staff across the country. And what really worried me more than anything else was the safety of our Iraqi staff, because they were the ones taking the risks. They were the ones out there on the streets trying to cover this story. As a foreigner in Iraq, I spent most of my time behind blast walls, behind these gigantic concrete blast walls that sort of enclosed our compound where we lived and worked. It was relatively safe. It was the Iraqi staff who were taking the risks. And during those initial months of the surge, the violence just got worse as US troops deployed into Baghdad. The insurgents fought back, Al-Qaeda fought back, and it all, I guess, for where the story reaches a nadir for me and for Reuters and for the Reuters family, was July 12, 2007, when a young photographer called Namir Noor Eldin was out just looking for a story in eastern Baghdad. He'd heard about a US airstrike on a building there at dawn. He was with a driver called Sayed Chum, who was very experienced, knew this area, and they were just doing what journalists do, out looking for a story. And the two of them had been there for a little while. Namir had taken some photographs which showed clearly that there was nothing happening around him that suggested there was any danger. He'd taken some great photographs. And then he and Sayed, they hooked up with a group of men, including a few of them who appeared to be armed. And that caught the attention of an Apache attack helicopter that was in the skies not far from where they were. And that Apache attack helicopter had the call sign Crazy Horse 18. And within a couple of minutes, Namir and Sayed and all those men were dead. And that footage was leaked to WikiLeaks by an incredibly brave whistleblower called Chelsea Manning. And then equally brave was the decision by Julian Assange to publish that footage in 2010 to the world. He called it collateral murder. And that tape, for the first time, showed what the war in Iraq really looked like and how the US waged war in Iraq. For me, I really, like, I guess people's response to a lot of traumatic situations, I buried what happened on that day for many years. 2 staff killed on my watch. I was responsible for their safety. And I found that my coping mechanism, my way of dealing with that was to just bury it. But then nearly 10 years later, I found myself in a situation where a lot of symptoms from my reporting days just started to emerge. A lot of the classic PTSD symptoms that I'm sure all of you would be familiar with, the nightmares, the flashbacks, the anxiety, the numbness started to surface. And then came the guilt and the shame around my 2 staff, Namir and Sayed, and this guilt and this shame just started to sort of seep into my every pore of my being, to the point where I started to really questioned. I started to question whether I had done enough at the time. Had I done everything I could to ensure their safety, and had I done enough when the tape when Julian Assange had released the tape? Had I done enough then? And basically every question I posed to myself 10 years later, I came up short. To put it simply, I found myself lacking in every respect. And what I felt because of all of this was intense shame. I was not the bureau chief that I thought I was. I was not the human being, the man, I suppose, that I thought I was. And it was those feelings of guilt and shame that I guess cut to the core of who I thought I was. And it wasn't that long after I was suicidal, basically. And it was at this point that my wife stepped in and said I needed help, and I needed help quickly. And we live in Tasmania, which is not great when it comes to acute mental health services. So she said, you need to get help in a psych ward, and you need it quick. And so it was arranged for me to go to the Ward 17 psychiatric unit in Melbourne, which is where a lot of veterans and first responders are treated. And so I had my first admission there. But before I went, I had a colleague who reached out to me, who'd also worked with me in Baghdad. And he said to me that, he said, you know, yeah, PTSD, a lot of us are struggling with PTSD, but he said, have you heard of this thing called moral injury? And this is like August 2016, and I'd never heard about it. But I looked it up. I Googled the term, and I saw that one of the things about moral injury was that it was how something that you did or you didn't do that deeply transgressed your own moral values, your own moral compass. And it was just like, that was me. I didn't protect my staff. I failed to protect my staff, and as a result, they died. And I just thought, yeah, that's me. That explains why I feel the way I feel. So I went off to Ward 17, and I was all over the place, of course. And it was, and during the 5 weeks that I was there, I actually learned more about PTSD and how that was affecting my whole brain and body, and how it had affected my family and the relationship with my partner. I didn't really delve too much into the moral dimension side of things, probably as much as I would have liked. There was just so much, I think there was just so much going on inside my head at the time, and there was so much to learn. But I had this amazing psychiatrist who'd been born in Tehran, and so, but we spoke about Namir and Sayed a lot. And although we never used the term moral injury, we talked about them a lot, and we talked about my guilt and shame, and she very quickly realized that this was something that I needed to, you know, atone for. I often said this, that I needed to atone for this. She never tried to talk me out of the fact that this was war. These sorts of things happen in the fog of war, and she never tried to say, don't blame yourself, this type of thing. And one day she really stunned me by coming into a session and saying she'd actually gone and watched the Collateral Murder tape. And I was like, wow. And so she knew she'd actually taken that time to go and understand what it was all about. And then I guess toward the end of the admission, you know, I felt I was making some progress, and I was reading, I kept reading stuff on the internet about moral injury and the sort of things that could help. And I came across an article written by, and I won't say who it was because I'll get the name wrong, but it was one of the folks in the States who've been doing a lot of research around moral injury. And they talked about how one of the ways that veterans in the US were able to make some progress in dealing with their moral injury was to write letters to the people that they felt that they had wronged, or that they had harmed, or that they hadn't helped. And so I go in to see my psychiatrist, and I say, you know, I feel like I think what would help is if I write letters to Namir and Sayed. And before I could even finish the sentence, she's getting all animated and excited and saying, yeah, that's a great idea. You know, she said, I feel there are things that you haven't said that need to be said. This could really help you in this journey. Anyway, this is right towards the end of my first admission. So I thought, yep, I'll get home, I'll write those letters, done. Anyway, I get discharged, I get home, and I don't know, I just didn't feel like, I found it hard to, as soon as I got home, I found it hard to write the letters. But at the same time, I bought this book called Adaptive Disclosure, which I'm sure all of you have, many of you would have read, heard about, by Brett Litz. one of the pioneers on moral injury research, and some of his colleagues. And so I read his book, and I thought, yeah, this is really helpful. You know, maybe I can get my psychologist in Launceston to work with me on this. You know, let's try and customize his book so that I'm able to find a way of, you know, we'll work out a treatment for myself that can help. But outside the Ward 17 environment, I was just finding it really difficult to talk about and address this issue. And each time my psychologist would try to talk about it in the mirror and said, I was just avoiding the topic. And I think it was just because I wasn't in that safe psych ward environment. I really found it hard to go there. And so fast forward 7 or 8 months later, and it's getting close towards the 10th anniversary of the deaths of my staff. So it's May, June 2017, nearly the 10th anniversary. And I'm really starting to go downhill mentally. A lot of those symptoms are starting to get worse again. And my partner, Mary, says, okay, I think, you know, I really think you need to go back to Ward 17 again, and to be in the psych ward, you know, to get through the anniversary. And it just sort of, and at the time I'm thinking, oh, you know, what have I got to do to get through this, to get to grips with this, with the hold this event has on me, the deaths of my staff from 10 years ago. What have I got to do to be able to move forward in my life? And I felt I'd only just been given this, I'd only just been made the mental health advocate for Reuters like the previous month. And I thought, how's this going to look? You know, I'm back in the psych ward. You know, I was thinking the wrong way about all this, when in fact, going back to the psych ward, you know, showed that it was actually showing that I was reaching out and getting help as opposed to being a negative, but that wasn't how I was thinking. Anyway, so I went back to the psych ward in June of 2017. But before I went, I was on the plane to Melbourne. I was making all these I was making notes, you know, what are the things I need to do? And I'd been reading some books by people like Ed Tick and Jonathon Shay, people who've really explored the whole concept of moral injury and the soul, especially how it relates to veterans in the United States. And so I was sort of thinking, you know, do I need to undertake some sort of healing journey? Is there something I need to do that will help me, I guess, get to the other side of this pain that I'm going through? And what might that journey look like? And who might I be able to speak to? Maybe I can speak to people like Ed. Maybe I can speak to Brett Litz. Maybe there's some sort of rituals I can go through. And so I get to Ward 17, and it turns out my wonderful Iranian psychiatrist is on maternity leave, so she's not there. The psychiatrist that is assigned to me, the first thing when I sit down with him is he's got this really sort of jolly personality, which just puts me off straight away. And then he says he's never heard of moral injury. And so I'm like, okay, well, this is not good. And so I'm quite blunt. I asked for another psychiatrist. There's a really good psychologist there who I like, and we get on well, but then she tells me she's going on leave for 10 days. So I think, okay, this is just crazy. I should just go home and come back another time. But then I decide to stay. And what I do is I email an old friend of mine called Matt Green, who's a journalist that I used to work with in Baghdad. And we just have this email exchange about, I tell him I'm back in Ward 17, and I'm trying to work out ways that I can move forward from what happened in Baghdad 10 years ago. And I tell him that I'm thinking of, I might do a social media post about the anniversary and so on. And he suggests, and Matt suggests to me, maybe what about having some sort of private commemoration of the day itself? And that gets me thinking that, okay, well, maybe there's something I can do that would be a way to show my respects for Namir and Sayed on the anniversary day. And there's something about our exchange that, I don't know, it just gets the wheels turning in my head. And I think to myself, gosh, I wonder what about Islam? And I wonder if there's something in Islam that could help me through this. And so I Google mosques in the area, and I see that there's a mosque a couple of kilometers away, the Heidelberg Mosque, and I see that they've got an imam who had been profiled in the Age newspaper recently, and so I walk to the mosque and find out where he lives, and he's not at home. But I walk back to Ward 17, thinking I'll go and find him another time, and then I asked to see the chaplain at Ward 17, thinking that maybe maybe by now this idea is formed in my head that maybe I can have a memorial service for Namir and Sayed on the 10th anniversary of their deaths, the 12th of July, 2017. And so the following morning, one of the nurses comes to my room and she says, "Oh yeah, the chaplain's here." She says, actually, she's not the chaplain, she's a spiritual care worker, but close. So I walk out to where the nurse's station is, and I see this young woman, blonde streaks of color through her hair, and she's red lipstick, and I think to myself, that's not the chaplain, but it is. And it's this amazing woman called Kath Slarks, who's the spiritual care worker. And we go into one of the meeting rooms at Ward 17, and she knows absolutely nothing about me. She just says, "How can I help?" And I briefly explain what's going on, what I'm thinking about. And she just says, "Look, what I say to Vietnam veterans here is that the military taught you how to fight. I'm here to try and help you how to live. And in your case, I want to see how I can help you move through this pain that you're in. And I'll do everything I can to help with that." And then so we just started talking about holding a memorial service for my dead staff, Namir and Sayed, in the Anzac Chapel at the Heidelberg Repatriation Hospital. And it became a way of, without me realizing it, it became a sort of a therapeutic process whereby all the planning that Kath and I did for this ceremony it was like therapy in a way. We sat down and we worked out, okay, so we're going to have candles. Kath said, what are the readings we'll have? I told Kath that I was writing a letter. I'd actually finally gotten around to starting to write this letter that I'd always wanted to write to them. I asked her if she could get a Muslim prayer mat for me, which she said she could. My partner Mary had sent me some little blue wrens that would represent the souls of Namir and Sayed. We talked about what we're going to put on the altar, and so it was all a way of we were bringing together symbols of Christianity and Islam, and I got some photographs of Namir and Sayed framed, which we're going to put on the altar as well. So, and then at each stage, we'd talk about the progress we'd made. I finally tracked down this imam, and I went and spoke to him, and he was amazing. He was born in Egypt, and he was completely unfazed at this, this middle-aged journalist knocking on his door and talking about collateral murder and what had happened in Baghdad, and said, so I said to him, what can I look for in Islam? How can I find forgiveness and peace in Islam? And he basically said, he tried to say, look, this was all preordained, it was the will of God and so on, which sort of reminded me of what I'd heard in all those years I'd worked in the Muslim world. And so I said to him, can I come to the next Friday prayers and just sit in the court, with the faithful? And he said, you're absolutely welcome to do so. And so I did that. And it was just, there was just something really, really spiritual about sitting there in that courtyard of the mosque, because there were too many people to actually just fit inside the mosque itself. And so a lot of people were sitting on mats just outside, and just sitting there hearing the call to prayer and just being with Muslims when they were praying, because I'd lived in the Muslim world for a long time. I just found that something so peaceful and spiritual about that, that it just, I guess, reminded me of Namir and Said, and reminded me of the wonderful times that I'd had in the Muslim world. And then a few days later, the time for the ceremony came around, the 12th of July 2017, and I remember that morning, one of the nurses saw me. I'd just woken up, and she said, how are you feeling? And I said, I'm a bit nervous, and she sort of said, well, what's the worst thing that could happen? And I said that, that I break down and cry, and I sort of stopped myself, and I said, well, actually, no, that's exactly what I want to happen. I want to show emotion at this, because for so long I hadn't shown any emotion. And then, so I met Kath at the chapel, and we went through I read my letter. She did some readings. I was able to ask Namir and Said for forgiveness. I was able to ask them to forgive me for not protecting them, for not keeping them safe. And at the end, after I finished reading my letter, I was thinking, why am I not crying? Why am I not feeling something? It was just, there was something missing, and it was really bugging me. And then Kath, she had some hot oil, and she put the sign of the cross on my forehead, and then she got me to put my hands in a wooden bowl, and she poured cold water over them. And this was right at the end of the ceremony, and I think for some reason I just felt myself being transported back into it's like being transported into the Tasmanian rainforest. And I thought, it was almost like that moment was a lifting of the burden that I'd carried for 10 years. That dunking of my hands in that cold water was that lifting of the weight. And then we blew out the candles that we had on the altar, and the smoke from those candles, as I watched the smoke rise into the air, that smoke sort of symbolized my guilt and my shame disappearing. And it was as if that whole burden had just lifted, and I felt cleansed. I really did. It was the most cathartic experience. And I walked out of that chapel with Kath, and I was just ready to go home, get on a plane, go home and just resume my life. That was nearly, it'll be 5 years in July. And I honestly can say that it's been I have not felt burdened by the deaths of my staff since, because of that ceremony. And I think what happened was that all the planning for that ceremony, the preparation for it, understanding that it was a moral injury, that it was something that I needed to heal my soul, and that Kath was there by my side, guiding me on this journey. Understanding all that, I think that the ceremony itself was just the culmination of that process, and that when that ceremony was over, that was sort of like, yes, it's time to put this pain away now and move forward with my life. And that is exactly how it's been. And so for me, it's just I actually find that a lot of journalists I know, I think have been through very sort of similar experiences. Maybe not so much in terms of the loss of the lives of staff members, but certainly in terms of the loss of colleagues, journalists who've lost their lives working overseas, colleagues, friends, but also the sheer horror of what journalists have witnessed overseas, and the sense that they have not been able to do anything about it, and that, I feel, has made many journalists feel that they live with this sense of, well, I didn't do enough, or I didn't do anything even, and also this sense that, did my stories, did my footage, did my photographs have any impact at the end of the day? And I think many journalists are left with this lingering sense that it's all counted for nothing. I know journalists who've worked in the Middle East who feel exactly that, and so they're left with this sense that journalism for them has just been something that has taken a great toll on their lives, and what they saw was just a lot of suffering and a lot of death as well, for which those places they went to are no better than when they first went there, and that there's just continued injustice and suffering without any positive outcome. And I know journalists are struggle to deal with that, which is something that certainly, just to take a sort of a broad look at journalism, media organizations really need to take a hard look at this and work out and just make this something that is discussed more broadly, because a lot of journalists are suffering as a result.
My goodness. I mean, I was transfixing, like what a storyteller. And you did say to me, you didn't think you'd be able to take up the half an hour. Well, we've done more than half an hour. So thank you. I have a question, which I'm sure is on everybody's mind. There's, well, two questions actually. During your story, you're on a search to solve what's going on for you. It's almost like you've got access to medical help and the best psychiatric support. But there was something that was driving you to say, there's more than this going on for me. Would that be how you felt? Because once you saw moral injury, it's like, that resonates with me.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Kathy. And it was I think part of it was the journalist in me, right? I just had this journalistic obsession to find out what was wrong with me. What was it that had made me so sick? And I just wasn't satisfied with what I was being, with what I I wasn't satisfied with the PTSD diagnosis. And I think as a journalist, when you get onto a big story, you just have to keep peeling back those layers. And for me, this has been the biggest story of my life, trying to work out, trying to unravel this whole trauma dynamic that has upended my family, really upended my whole life, my whole family. And so when that happens, you will email, you will ring up anyone in the world you have to get to the bottom of it. And I still do that because I'm still determined to get to the bottom of this story. And that's why I've written this book. It's why I will keep trying to find the best possible answers so that other people will have a better understanding of moral injury and trauma, so that people can just get the best treatment, because that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the last question is with regard to media organisations. Can you touch on the fact that we've got to give journalists better support? And certainly with the Dart Centre and other places, we are having, at least awareness. But have you sort of narrowed down, as somebody having been in the field, what should be there for journalists? Because you're witnessing trauma. You're there, you're not there to participate, you're witnessing. So that puts an immense pressure psychologically on an individual.
Yeah, look, it's where to start. I think media organizations, the bosses of media organizations are doing a shocking job in looking after the mental health of their journalists. And I'm talking globally, across the world, in Australia and beyond. I know so many journalists who are suffering from so many different media organizations because they contact me and they say, how can I get help? What can I do? It makes me so angry to see so many of my colleagues in distress, suicidal, unable to work, too afraid to put their hand up to get help because they're afraid they'll lose their job or they will be marginalized and stigmatized. It is unconscionable that this is happening today. In terms of what can be done, it all comes down to prevention. I think at the end of the day, there has to be so much emphasis on prevention and changing the culture in journalist organizations so that journalists feel comfortable putting their hand up and seeking help. And I think to really, one thing that media organizations can do, and it's one thing, is they can make it a stated policy that the career of no journalist will be affected if someone puts their hand up and seeks help. Journalists can make that stated policy, put it in writing. Your career won't be affected if you put up your hand and say you need help for mental health or stress reasons. Just make it stated policy, so that it's absolutely clear that media organizations are going to look after stuff, because that's what journalists are afraid of.
Thanks for joining us, Dean.
You're welcome, Kathy. My pleasure.